things. And so as part of this your interview, what we want to do is we'll start with a little bit of just Angela's background and how she got into healthcare and startups. Then we'll transition to Physician 360, telling us what that's about and what they're working on and a little bit of the journey there. And then lastly, we'll wrap up just with some general thoughts on entrepreneurship and healthcare in Atlanta from Angela. And so if you have questions throughout, feel free to put them in the chat and JC will collect those. And then at the end, she'll ask them back to Angela and us. So great. So with that, Angela, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, we're excited. So maybe we'll just start, at the little bit of the beginning of coming to Atlanta and healthcare and such. I think you have a unique background, both physician and entrepreneur, which is fascinating. So from the Northeast, I think you came down to Emory. How and why did you come down to Emory to get started?
Sure. I actually just told this story yesterday, and I wish I could state that it was this very strategic foresight that I had, but as a rebellious teenager who was looking for colleges, I literally drew a 500-mile radius around my house and decided to look for schools outside of that boundary. And so Emory was one of them. I'm glad that I made that choice because, here we are so many years later, and Emory's ecosystem for health tech is just like amazing. There are things in my life where I'm like, wow, I missed the window of opportunity there. I was a little late to that party. I feel the total opposite about Atlanta. I feel like I was actually ahead of the curve and a trendsetter, if you will. And we're really now just coming into our own. But I came to Atlanta for the first time to attend Emory as an undergrad.
Very cool. And when you came to Emory, did you know you wanted to be in healthcare or have an idea, or did that evolve as you came down?
No, actually back then I was this is really going back, but I was a poli-sci major. I think everyone who knew me thought I would be a lawyer. This is really a total tangent, but I don't think we do a great job at kind of helping young people identify like their unique skills and talents in the world. And long story short, I do feel like we kind of silo them into, oh, you do X, so you should be a lawyer. You're good at math and science, so you should be a doctor. And so I think perhaps we're not as creative as we could be with just career development. But long story short, I think at that time I was good at math and science and didn't know I was heading in that direction, but did take all the pre-med classes. And then took a ton of time off after graduation. I was not one of those people that was like, I've always been meant to be a physician but it was kind of a dream I couldn't put to rest. I kept coming back to it. There seemed to be things in my life where, if you will, the universe was kind of pushing me in that direction. And so did end up years later going to medical school back in New York and trained in emergency medicine in Charlotte, North Carolina at a hospital system that then was called Carolinas Medical Center, now is called Atrium Health.
Yep.
They always evolve into these very, nebulous one-term names. So Atrium Health, and then came back to Atlanta as a faculty member in the School of Medicine at Emory University. So kind of went full circle there and have been back in Atlanta now for, I guess, 6 or 7 years.
Very cool. So as you evolved to decided to, got into healthcare, went into medicine, med school, physician in the ER, when did you start to get an idea that you may want to be involved in a startup? How did that evolve to say, hey, I want to go be an entrepreneur as well?
I think the ER doc to health tech CEO might seem a little strange, but in looking back, I think it was my ER experience that literally laid the groundwork for that transition. In addition to the fact that being an ER doctor, you are literally an expert in making decisions, consequential decisions with incomplete information, which is a lot of what I do now on a daily basis. But it's also that you're sitting at the gateway into the healthcare system and really into humanity. I don't think there's a better place to study the human condition than in an emergency department when you're seeing the best and the worst of people in their best and worst moments. And so I think it was just that I sat at that vantage point for long enough to see what a struggle it was for everyday people like you and me, working parents, single parents, young professionals, et cetera, and just to see the struggle of doing something basic like getting a throat swab. And at the point where I think that gap, when that pain point became so undeniable, that was kind of when I made the jump.
And so as you're thinking through that jump, I want to talk on that a minute. That's something I know a lot of entrepreneurs always struggle with is how do I make that jump? I may know I want to do something, but not sure the idea, or I have an idea and how do I dabble in it part-time versus eventually go full-time? Talk us through that journey of realizing there were problems, knowing you may be able to solve some of those, and then moving beyond just, hey, this could be an interesting idea to, I want to go explore it further.
That's such a hard question. And honestly, I think because I made such a massive transition, people ask me it often, and the cadence of the transition is very personal. And obviously there's a lot of factors that are going to go into making that decision. I think for me, I did try to make, we'll call them more minor pivots. So I was already in academia and I kind of said to myself, could I do something entrepreneurial within academia? I guess I looked for ways that I could make smaller shifts so that there wasn't so much disruption to my life. And ultimately for me, that wasn't the perfect fit. So I did end up, leaving and making a more major transition. But I guess that would probably be my advice, is that yourself, each of you, better than anyone else, presumably in the world. And so you just have to kind of know your personality. If you are a little bit more risk adverse, or if that major transition is going to be so uncomfortable that it's detrimental, try to look for ways within your current setup and your current infrastructure that you can do something entrepreneurial. Like I said, ultimately for me, that wasn't the right fit. And I did end up leaving. I do still stay connected to my clinical life, if you will. I work, a handful, of shifts a month in a rural hospital actually here in Georgia, which would otherwise have been completely unimportant, except they got hit very hard with COVID. And so I was living the pandemic on a lot of fronts through this year. But anyway, I think the transition, it's impacted financially. You have to figure out in your personal life who is going to help support that. And ultimately, it's very personal when you make that leap.
Sure. No, that's very good stuff. So Angela, just for context for folks, as we transition to Physician 360 and this idea, just what's the elevator pitch just for folks on the call who may not know what Physician 360 does?
Sure. So our mission was about reimagining the practice of urgent and emergent care. So we are a virtual health clinic, and we primarily transform neighborhood pharmacies into urgent cares by empowering them with two things, well, really three things: a software, and access to a clinical network, so on-demand telemedicine consults, and rapid tests. Our goal was about creating a comparable virtual experience for patients so that they could access convenient, cost-effective, and still diagnostically accurate healthcare for things that you otherwise would go to an urgent care for. So strep, flu, and UTI, things of that nature. So yeah, if you'd like me to talk more about it.
Yeah, we'll go into the story in more detail. I just want to give people some context.
Sure.
As we started to jump in. So again, back to that, you were debating, you saw the problems in the ER, right? You were trying to figure out, how do I do this while I'm still teaching, and said, hey, I need to go more full-time. Talk us through all right, here was my initial idea when I sort of left to go after this full-time. Like, what was my initial idea, and how did you think about vetting that there was something there with that idea?
Mm-hmm. So, right, it started with, okay, why is it so difficult to do something simple like get a strep swab? And we looked at what else was available and felt that every other offering had a significant miss, meaning maybe it was convenient, but it was really expensive. Or maybe it was, there was telemedicine, and this is pre-COVID, this is back in 2017. So telemedicine was already prevalent, but we were like, telemedicine on its own is only 75% accurate. So, okay, so you've got something now that's convenient and cost effective, but it's not diagnostically accurate. So we looked at the landscape and said, is there anything else out there that really connects the dots for the patient? Because that's where the value lies. And we felt that the answer to that was no. But that's just a thought, like you said, and you can run ideas through all kinds of, and everyone has different ways of doing this. There's all kinds of simulators and matrices. And but what we found was that one of the best ways to really evaluate that, was there truly a gap that was significant enough for patients to purchase the product? We tested it. So before we went and built our own software, before we went and built our own products and really dove into that level, we took surrogates, we took surrogate software, we took surrogate products, and we put them into the market to see if people would purchase them, and they did. So, I know not every company, every company is going to be a little bit different, and there's nuances that are well beyond my understanding for what each of you do. But I think one of the things that we did that was, a good test was an actual test of the market.
Mm-hmm. I love hearing that, Angela, because I think, oftentimes entrepreneurs feel like you have to go build this massive product that's all perfect before you try and go test it.
Yeah.
And I love how you're talking about, hey, how do you go test and prove that demand there? Just cobbling it together from whatever may be out there.
Yeah.
As a way to prove that. So as you're going through that testing process, what were some of the learnings you had that says we're onto something here?
So there were many learnings that I would say the initial learnings were not so much that we're onto something. That came a little later. It was more we're onto something, and so it was recognizing that what we were initially doing, it was showing us where the hiccups were going to be and where the hurdles were going to be. And so, one of the first things we learned, for example, was it's incredibly expensive to get in front of an end user, in this case, a patient or a consumer, especially when you are a no-name, no credibility company, right? Especially, so, healthcare is obviously an industry where trust and credibility is everything. And so to get in front of someone with this prototype or an MVP and convince someone to use it, it's very difficult. And so that realization actually informed a lot of what became our actual go-to-market model of partnering with the pharmacies. We realized that it was going to be hard for us to get in front of patients, again, at that cost of acquisition. And they don't know us from Adam. So how do we bridge that gap? And we were able to say, okay, these independent pharmacies, they have an established relationship with these folks. They already have a captive audience of patients. The pharmacy is actually where people go when they're not feeling well. So that's actually the moment in their life when they need our services most. And so that's, we were like, okay, let's try that now. So then it was, let's test the product in this way. And that's when we started to be like, okay, now we have traction. And that's also what gave us the realization of, now we're not only solving a problem for the patient who needed access to cost-effective, convenient, diagnostically accurate care, but we're actually now also solving a parallel problem for the pharmacy. These smaller independent pharmacies, they're trying to figure out who they're going to be in this next phase of healthcare. They're trying to compete with retail minute clinics. They don't have the resources to build things like minute clinics. And we give them a way to compete with retail pharmacies by a turnkey solution for clinical services. So it wasn't like we started on day one being like, this is it. It was, I think it's that feedback you're getting from the test that really then make you fit perfectly to go to market.
Sure. I love that continual evolution, right? That you have a hypothesis and you're just constantly learning, tweaking. So that very interesting, right?
Yeah, it sounds beautiful now. I mean, in retrospect, right, it sounds very like, oh, we had this idea and then we tried this thing and got this glorious feedback from the universe. I mean, let's be honest. In real time, it doesn't feel that way. You're like, oh, we've hit another wall. Okay, right. That sucked. That was disappointing. I mean, I just want to keep it honest because it is a journey. It's a rough journey.
It's always way messier than it sounds looking back, right?
That's right.
So tell me that transition, right? Because I think this is important for people to understand, right? Is, hey, you were initially solving a problem for the patients, and as you got into it, you realized, hey, that may be hard to reach. There's this other related entity, and especially that's important in healthcare. Talk me through how those conversations went with pharmacies and who you were talking to there, just help you realize there's an opportunity to go that route.
Sure. I think, initially when we started interacting with the pharmacy, initially we saw it as I don't want to sound selfish, but it was much more unilateral. I think until, like you said, we had we didn't call it this then, but once we started to kind of have a critical mass of these pharmacies who seemed interested, we then had a working, almost like a customer advisory board, right? We had now a team of pharmacists, especially those early adopters. Like those were people who like saw the vision of what we were trying to do. Those were the pharmacists who had always been like, listen, we're really underutilized. Like, yes, let's try this, because they had been pushing for increased scope for a long time. So we were just kind of coming in and reinforcing their vision of the world too. Once we had that core group, then it was easy to say to them, all right, this part worked. What didn't work? What are you seeing on the front lines that we're not seeing? And for the most part, it really did shift. It was like I don't want to say that the patient isn't our customer anymore. Ultimately, they are. And that is part of the challenge, the excitement and the challenge of a B2B2C model, but the pharmacist became much more of our direct customer. And so figuring out what their primary need was, what became I guess the primary driver. And that was a big shift for us.
Very, very important. And one last question on that, because I think it's an important one in healthcare, right? In healthcare, you've got probably many more constituents than you would for another business, right? You mentioned just the pharmacies and the patients, but you may, depending on what your business is, you may have the hospital systems or the payers involved, or right? How is there any way you think about that, of how to piece together the needs of the different constituents and which ones you have to spend more time with or less time with or align as you're growing your business?
Yeah, I mean, I think that so for context and transparency, at this point, we're payer, we're payer, we're product, we're everything agnostic, meaning, what we've built is a model and a software, and I consider that like the connective tissue, right? But it is agnostic in the sense that when a new technology comes out, we can plug it into our virtual health clinic, and it services the same way, and another product can be plugged in, and it can function like that for this payer and that payer. So we've stayed agnostic. And so with that context and that transparency, I will say, ultimately, I think you build your product, at least at the outset, for who you consider to be your primary customer. And I think if you kind of keep that compass, then you'll never get pulled so off course, because the regulatory landscape, the payer landscape, all of those other stakeholders, the landscape for those things changes so quickly that I think if you start trying to follow them, you're going to ultimately find that you don't know what you're building and for whom anymore. And so I know it's really hard, because I think as we start to talk about scale, ultimately there comes a point where in healthcare, I do think you have to align with some larger conglomerate. But I think in the early phases, using the customer that you consider to be primary as the compass is what helps most.
Awesome. Makes sense. So two more areas, and as we're probably got like 10 minutes left, then we'll transition to Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and JC will collect those. So Angela, as one of the terms we always hear in the startup world a lot is product market fit. And that means different things to different people, but talk us through from your perspective, how you thought about that as you were evolving and how that changed as you continue to grow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that everybody has a slightly different definition of this. I mean, I think some people use certain revenue markers to say, yes, you've shown product market fit. I mean, I think the first thing that I'd reiterate is what you just said, is that it's an iterative process. And I think what you consider to be product market fit on day one should be different than what you're considering to be product market fit on year two. And so, but to me, it was the point where we figured out who couldn't live without what we were building and why. And I think, as I alluded to earlier, that really changed. Initially we were building something that was primarily for the patient, and still ultimately is, but I think figuring out that the connection to the pharmacist and figuring out who found that problem to be significant enough to pay for the solution, that for me was product market fit. And a lot of us, I think we start with something that is nice to have. It's not that hair on fire problem, and there's a lot of things that impact that. I mean, for us, I would never wish for a pandemic again, but timing is everything. COVID, I think, did illuminate for a lot of people that what we were building was way beyond a nice to have. It was actually going to be the foundation of how medicine is practiced going forward. And so I think there's a lot of moving parts that contribute to when you hit true product market fit.
Mhm. I love so what you said there, Angela, right? That it does always evolve, right? But that nice to have to must have, where is that must have? And as you said, right, they would be completely disappointed if your product went away because they would rely on it to solve the problem. I think it's a great marker there. So as you're evolving that and starting to grow, how do, one of the questions we always get from entrepreneurs is, when should I raise money? Should I raise money at all? How do I do that? How did you start to think about, should we raise money? And if so, how to do that?
Yeah. So, we were initially bootstrapped. And then like, I feel like it's like dog years. I feel like this year, the time is flying by and simultaneously standing still. So I'm like, in the fall of 2019, we did raise a seed round of venture capital from Valor Ventures. I think for us, it was about, we had a clear, finite need for capital and how we were going to deploy that capital. And that need had then a very clear connection to a value inflection point. And I think that's probably what I would say is when you should be raising capital. It's when you have a clear understanding of how your company's value increases and you need an infusion, a boost in order to get there. Again, other thing I'll say about that, as I alluded to with COVID, perhaps the need isn't that you have to build something, right? It's not like, oh, I have to build a technology or a platform and that's what I need the capital for. Perhaps the market changes and now you have a need to capture market share faster, or you have new opportunities given the technology you've already built that you really need to capitalize on. So I think there has to be some demand that is very, very tactical and very tangible, and that's why you raise capital. And I think we deployed that seed round the way that we had intended to. It did in fact increase the value of our company the way that we had hoped. With everything going on this year, we then raised a bridge round because of the new opportunities with COVID, because of how we saw the landscape changing. And so, I think it's for large tech companies, there are definitely ways I applaud people who are able to bootstrap the entire thing and who can grow from their revenue and their profitability alone. But I think if you're going to raise outside funding, the point where you know exactly what you're deploying it for and how it's going to impact your company's values is when I would do it.
I think that is such great advice there, Angela, because I think oftentimes I see folks say, well, I should raise money because that's what everybody does, or that's what I should do, right? Or I raise money when I'm still trying to figure out what it is I'm doing, versus I like sort of your two parameters there, right? Look, you've already got a clear, defined focus of how you're going to spend the money, and that money is tied to a valuation inflection point or specific ROI or metrics that can help inflect it. Because otherwise, it can be very dilutive to your business to raise money. As we were talking in the breakout room, I've built plenty of products where you just go build more features and you just end up wasting a lot of money. Yeah. Versus you got a clearly defined need and it can tie to a valuation inflection point.
And raising capital is a lot of work. I mean, and so you have to say to yourself, you're going to be spending a lot of time doing something and you're doing it inefficiently if you don't have, again, because investors know that. I mean, unless they're incredibly unsavvy, but investors are going to want to know that you have a plan and that you're going to be able to increase your company's value. That's how they make money. That's how they make their return. So it's like, if you don't have those things figured out ahead of time, then you're wasting your own time as a founder seeking capital that you're never going to qualify for because you don't have a plan for it. And so,
makes a lot of sense. So what's sort of next for Physician 360, Angela? As you're looking forward to, obviously pandemic has come and created lots of opportunities and challenges in healthcare, and you were positioned very well for a market like this. What does 2021 look like as you're growing Physician 360?
Sure. This year, nobody obviously anticipated this. So for us this year was a lot about COVID. We did roll out new products this year, specifically for COVID testing. And but when I think about where we're headed, we've two things. I guess one, we have this model that's B2B2C, and I think we've grown our network. Now we have over 1,000 pharmacies in our network, and we've done well with that first phase of B2B. And this next year will really focus on pharmacy success and their sell-through. And so learning all of those things that we learned about the B2B prong, now we'll be learning them about the B2C prong in facilitating pharmacy sell-through. So that's definitely a focus of ours for 2021. The other thing is that we've built this infrastructure now. Again, I call it the connective tissue, but the platform that connects the patient, that connects the pharmacy, that connects the doctor, and we can plug and play, right? So we can continue to try to approximate a completely comparable brick and mortar office visit. So to us, that means layering in other technologies. So we just rolled out, for example, an ear infection test kit that has a digital otoscope. I'm not aware of actually many others, if any, telemedicine companies that diagnose ear infection, because it's very difficult if you can't see someone's inner ear. So the fact that we were able to now layer on this new peripheral to, again, approximate exactly what you'd experience if you went to your pediatrician, for example, that's where we're headed. We'll continue to do that. Now we've done it for ear infection. We'll continue to do it for other conditions to the point where we are able to service every medical condition that you ever could experience, literally from your couch. And, yeah.
Very, very cool. Well, two questions here to wrap up, Angela, and then we'll open up for the questions, to the floor there. Any other lessons learned that you could share with entrepreneurs we haven't touched on that, having been at this, a couple of years now and seen many, ups and downs, any other lessons learned you'd share or advice you'd share with the group here?
Sure. I mean, some of it, I guess I could say, is very tactical, and some of it's very lovey-dovey. The first part I'll say is, especially within health tech, definitely look for or pay attention to regulatory and to policy tailwinds. A lot changed during coronavirus, not just the fact that there was this new viral condition to service, but the practice of telemedicine, the reimbursement for telemedicine, so much of it evolved to really support the growth of that sector. And so I think, especially in healthcare, which is so highly regulated, paying attention to those market force changes can really accelerate your evolution as a company. As a founder, I would say what I learn every day is that there's no secret sauce, or if there is, someone is keeping it hidden from me. A lot of it just has to do with resilience and the belief that you can figure things out just as well as anybody else can. And honestly, the ability to combat disappointment and discouragement in a healthy way. I think, for every one, smiling face LinkedIn post that I make, there's been 10 things that didn't work out quite as I had hoped. And so being able to recognize that and I think to balance that in your heart is fundamental to getting through the journey.
I love that. And I do think you shared part of the secret sauce is that resiliency that you see, right? There will be ups and there will be many more downs than ups sometimes, and being able to positively work through those and adapt, I think is a common trait that I see from successful founders. So last question, Angela, for you, just Atlanta and the healthcare ecosystem, what can Atlanta do to better support healthcare entrepreneurs and building great businesses?
There is so much here. I will say we are so well positioned. I mean, between all of the incubators, both located within academia and outside in industry, just the academic institutions supporting technology and, healthcare and medicine, we have all the component parts. I think that a lot of it is about connecting the dots. And, from a funding perspective, I think perhaps we're still a little bit young in our, we're just coming into our own as far as like healthcare tech. And maybe, you know, getting a few veterans of this space into the Atlanta ecosystem would be helpful, because it is a little bit different. It is more nuanced. The time course is different, you know, navigating the risks and liabilities of the FDA, et cetera. So I think, like with anything, the more experienced, you know, folks we have at the table, the easier the pathway will be for those of us who are just diving into it now. But we have all the component parts here, and I'm sincerely so excited to see where this city is in 10 to 15 years, because I hear it now from my friends all across the country, even in Silicon Valley, which was like so 90s, right? I'm like, yeah, you guys, you had your moment, and I see it. We're about to have ours.
Well, I love what you said there, Angela, and appreciate all you're doing to help further that mission and support Atlanta healthcare. So we love all the great things you're doing. So let me turn it over back to JC now. I know a couple questions have come through directly to you in the chat, and if you have any others, folks, feel free to chat JC as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Angela. This has been wonderful. I'll kick this off a little bit. And again, as AT said, feel free to DM me or put them out there. But one thing, kind of like in the telehealth space, you're talking a little bit about what's next for you even this year. What do you think the next thing in telehealth in general is? You know, like maybe that's even in addition to you, or do you think that's kind of where you guys are headed? Maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. I'll just speak to the two things that I think are going to drive a lot of innovation in the coming years. The first is just the consumer as a driver of everything. And so I do think that telehealth in general is just part of that. But I think if we start thinking about it in a more tactical way, it's the consumer as a driver of every part of it. So even thinking about like all the things that you ever associated with a hospital or ever associated with I mean, look at Amazon's announcement about their online pharmacy service now. So anything you used to in your mind be like, there's no way you could ever do that from home. I think we just have to completely throw that out the window and be like, how are we going to do it from home? I think there is going to come a point where literally everything we do in healthcare is done from home. And so that's number one. The other one is not so much about telehealth, but I do feel strongly about this one. And that is the microbiome. So the bacteria that are in your gut, I feel very strongly that the same way we went through this boom from, genetics and looking at the gene pool and how do we map that, we're going to do the exact same thing with the microbiome. And I think we're going to learn that it might be just as important as our genes. So those are the two things that I think are probably going to define the next decade in healthcare.
Awesome. Yeah. That's exciting to hear. Another question here is, and maybe this comes from your background in the medical side, but how do you build or kind of scale your technology and different in a healthcare tech company versus others? Is there something specific that the health or medical side needs to do when you're building and scaling the technology, and maybe like the sales process, et cetera, when you're scaling that company? What's different about the medical side of things?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is the same, to your point. I mean, as you scale, any company is going to need to put process and infrastructure in place to automate things and to make things more efficient. And the formula for scale is the same, I think, regardless of industry. How do you increase revenue and decrease expense and have high customer retention? I think what's specific maybe about healthcare is that it is difficult to do that without, at some point, alignment with a larger conglomerate. And this goes back to what AT and I were talking about earlier, which is we have remained agnostic to this point. Do I think that there will be maybe a moment in our future where it makes sense to align with the hospital system, where it makes sense to align with a payer? I think that in healthcare is unique in that that's how you keep high customer retention. That's how you decrease your cost of acquisition. Some of those parameters that in other sectors are a little bit more creative, I think in healthcare, the options are more limited. So I think that's probably what to me seems most unique within healthcare about scaling is that alignment with strategic partners.
And JC, let me ask one more question just related to that. to Angela there, right? About, because I think healthcare, another thing I think unique about healthcare and unique about your situation, right, is being a physician as well. How important or what benefits does it bring to have somebody on the founding team or an advisor that's in the medical community versus all on the technology or business side?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, you obviously you want your founding team or your leadership team to have a balanced set of skills. So in this case, do I think it was absolutely necessary that I was a physician? No, I think it was necessary that my chief medical officer was, for sure. But I do think there is an inherent sense of trust and understanding that I see in customers and other stakeholders that probably wouldn't be there without that. When I talk to pharmacists, especially some of these smaller, independent pharmacies, they're small businesses and they're struggling to figure out how to carry out the mission of what they wanted to do, which was help their patients, and still run a successful business in this ever-changing landscape. And I think I can say to them, I was part of that. I know I understand what changed in my clinical life because of X, Y, and Z insurer decision. So I think there is like that common ground, which does go a long way. I don't think it's a deal breaker, but it's definitely helpful.
Great.
Awesome. Yeah. That was aligning with the last question, actually. So since we're at, 8:59, I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So perhaps we'll go ahead and wrap up AT, but if other questions come in, feel free, we can always follow up. But AT, yeah, let's go ahead and take us home.
Thank you again, Angela, for spending the time with us this morning, and folks for joining. We continue to look forward to watching your progress here and seeing Physician 360 and all the great things you're doing. And I love what you said about the future of healthcare being in the home. I just think there's so much to that that nobody wants to go to doctor's offices and wait in line and do stuff that could be done from home. And so I think that's a great trend to follow. But I know we're wrapping up. Here's our last one for the year. We'll kick back up in February. Actually, we have Shane Jackson from Jackson Healthcare who's going to come speak at our next healthcare meetup in February on the 10th here. But until then, hope folks have a great holidays, are able to relax, enjoy some time with family, and obviously stay healthy. And we'll be cheering for all the vaccines and treatments to come forward and get us all back to face as soon as we can. All right. Thank you, Angela. And thank you everybody for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Have a great day.
Bye.